Welcome back to Absolutely Interdisciplinary. I'm Beth Coleman, and I'm an associate professor here at the University of Toronto. Oh, fantastic. At the Institute of Communication, Culture, Information, and Technology, and the Faculty of Information. And also, I'm a research lead at Schwartz Reisman Institute. And I want to take a quick moment to also add my thanks to Gillian Hatfield for her leadership and intellectual generosity and just the community that has come together here. Okay, I am delighted to moderate this session on AI and the future of democracy with Harper Reed. Now, our topic is a timely one as the world approaches its biggest election year in recent history. So while at the same time that we've seen the spread of generative AI systems that's made it easier to create a deluge of content that may sway voters, misinformation, deepfakes, we're also going to discuss how AI might be used toward forwarding democracy. So also, I just want to let you know that this session is being filmed for What Now AI, a podcast on AI out of the University of Toronto, hosted by me and the lovely Rahul Krishnan. So it means if you ask questions and things, you might end up on the podcast. And the episode will be released on May 23rd on podcasting platforms and YouTube. Okay, let's get to the main event. Let's welcome Harper Reed. Harper is a technologist who predicts the future for a living. He's a builder, a hacker, and also a speaker on those topics. He was the CTO of Obama's 2012 campaign. Obama won, if you were wondering how that ended. He's among the first to bring a tech mentality to the political realm. He's also pioneered crowdsourcing at Threadless. He founded Modest Inc., has guided platform software teams at PayPal, and most recently, General Galactic Corporation was his endeavor. He's also on the advisory board for the RAND Institute and is an Annenberg Innovation Fellow. He is really in touch with many different things. But in getting in touch with Harper about the topic of AI in the future, I really thought we would benefit from a conversation from someone who helped create a blueprint around something that was really powerful and then also taken on again in a really powerful way with the election of Trump, but perhaps in a different direction. Okay, so let's welcome Harper, and we're going to have. This is going to be in the format of discussion because I promised Harper that I wouldn't just leave him up here by himself. That he couldn't do it. So we're going to start with two questions about history. So let's start with data for democracy. Harper, what did you do making the Obama data machine? What was the strategy? What kind of data did you use? Did you use persuasive design? What kind of automation? So tell us, what did you guys do?
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm sorry I'm not in the room. I would have loved to be there. But the dynamic life of a parent. So the exciting thing about this is that I get to talk about one of my favorite time periods of my life, one of the most frenetic experiences of my life. And hopefully I can share some insights from there because I do think right now is such an important time, both in how we're defining technology and our relationship with technology, but also the policy surrounding this. And we have a chance to make a difference. Positive or negative. So back in 2011, when I joined the Obama campaign, I was largely just a tech person. And in many ways, I say that because there's this important nuance that I think we need to kind of dig into a bit, which is tech had not really participated in campaigns in the United States before. It had been very superficial, very ad hoc, but in 2011, we did what amounted to a very elaborate and deliberate tech program. And so I say that to answer your question because one of the key parts of campaigns circa 2011, 2012 was that by kind of default, based on the modeling, which we can get into, we don't do persuasion. And so our goal is entirely based on turnout. And so fundamentally, the technology we built was not about convincing someone that at that time that Mitt Romney was a bad person or a good person or whatever. We did do that because of the public comms, et cetera, but it was more, the tech was more about making sure that you got to vote. And to give you an idea how this worked is we had a lot of tech that was surveillance of one kind or another, looking at voter files, calling people on the phone and then reporting back to our databases, et cetera, to just define whether someone had voted. So an example is my brother lives in Colorado. That's where I'm originally from. On election day in 2012, he received 3 knocks on the door about an hour apart. Then he went and voted, and no one knocked on his door from then on because we knew that he hadn't voted. And then we knew the moment he did vote. And then we were able to use our resources to say that person already voted. Let's not bother them any longer. And so another example was if you were sending a volunteer into a neighborhood in Dubuque, Iowa, to knock on doors, an important place from a battleground state, we would not send someone to knock on doors of someone who was a Republican because we weren't going to waste their time or our time because our goal was just to get the more people to vote for us, just turnout. And our modeling was very straightforward. And this was tested over many years from 2004 all the way to 2012, which was that if 10 people voted, 6 people voted for Democrats. It's very important if you want to know why 2016 was different is because that model changed. And that was one of the big differences between 2012 and 2016. But that's not what we're here to talk about. And so from a tech standpoint, all we did was, in kind of simple terms, all we did was make tech a force multiplier for the volunteer. And so that meant people were calling, we automated the calling. People were sending messages, we automated that message sending. We did that through really elaborate machine learning driven tools for like Facebook. We did it through very brute force tools for things like SMS. We also had very simple tools that would just pop up a record and say, hey, call this person. And that was as simple as it was with a script or what have you. It's important to underscore that we did everything, like from ML to not ML to manual printed on paper to automated, really intense machine learning based flows. Like we did everything. The team was very big. And so we could spend so much time talking about what we did do, but I think it's probably less interesting for the audience there.
I have a couple of requests. One, can you say what Obama said to you, but do your kind of Obama thing when you say it?
I don't know if I can do an Obama thing, but I can definitely say that he made fun of my beard. The first thing he said.
Say to you about what your job was. Your job
Well,
was to make sure people heard what he was saying.
Yeah, so there's a couple interesting things. And I don't know how deep you want to get into this because the first thing that anyone from the campaign said as soon as I was hired was, Harper, don't fuck it up. That literally is the first words that were said to me as my official title. They're like, welcome to the team, don't fuck it up. And I was just like, oh, okay, this is really intense. But the key was that we weren't doing tech. And my career was I was a CTO for a big t-shirt company that everyone loved, and we invented crowdsourcing on accident, all this stuff. And so I looked like a tech person. One of the first things that they told me was like, we hired you because you looked like a CTO. Like from a comms perspective, they were like, you look like a CTO. So like when we put you in a magazine, everyone's gonna be like, that guy looks like a startup guy. He must be smart. Which is a really interesting take on like why we can't hire diverse people in tech. But like there's a really strong thing there of like, that was one of the reasons. But the second thing that really came out of this was everything we did, from how we picked a database software to what interface we were building, really came from Barack Obama's perspective on grassroots organizing. And that was a hard bit for me to kind of wrap my head around because I remember when they said to me, Harper, you may make a decision that is not the right tech decision, but will be the right political decision. And that was something that came up a lot. And there's also things where we were like, okay, we can make the right political decision here, but is it the right decision for the users? An example of this is we created a model, the analytics team, and then my team helped make it so it was the public could use it, that would analyze your Facebook interactions with the Facebook graph, because we had very unlimited access to the Facebook graph, and we were able to basically determine who your best friends were. And this was pretty intense because best friends could also be an estranged spouse or relative. Like your interactions may look nice and comfortable, but may be bad. And so we basically had this script that we could run, and it would be like, here's your best friend. And it was very accurate, scary accurate. And we learned a lot from our early tests. And we were just like, we have to not be creepy. One of the examples was the interface for this, the user experience for this, which thank God we had such amazing user experience people, which I think is actually one of the things that's missing from a lot of the AI work right now, is not thinking about the human interaction aspect. But we had these great human interaction people. And one of the things they said is, rather than just saying, here's your best friend, let's actually put it in a list of people and have you choose, but we'll just order it by who we think your best friend is. And so we're not saying this is your best friend. We're not bragging about our model. We're not saying how cool our ML is. We're just saying, hey, we just happen to sort it this random way, and make it easy for you to find that person. Because before it was real creepy and real bad. You don't necessarily want me to surface your ex and be like, hey, check this out.
For you, but I first want you to talk a little bit more about the cycle of getting people to vote was number one. So hearing Obama's message, getting people to the polls, but also some things around lawyers at the polls, like making sure there weren't barriers to people voting. So how did that fit into the kind of like tech organization, from analytics to messaging around getting people out with automation, but then something like supporting lawyers being there to make sure people could vote?
Yeah, there's a long history in the United States to both suppressing the vote and protecting the vote. Not just the United States, but we have a specific history with that. And so on the Dem side, they have this funny thing where they hire voter protection lawyers, and on the Republican side, they hire voter suppression lawyers. And they're both like very they're both fighting for the same thing. We want to make sure the right people vote, and it just who the right person is very different. Typically the Dems are looking for voter access. And typically Republicans are making sure Mickey Mouse isn't voting. Great. What we found, though, was, and historically the Dems have been very good at this, where if you go to the polls, for instance, in a contested area, there's some sneaky stuff that may happen. They may shut the polls and they say, oh, like no more voting or what have you, or they maybe flyer a predominantly, like Black neighborhood in Miami, for instance, or in Florida, and say, oh, election day has changed. Misinformation tactics that are paper. These are not ML based or AI based. And just trying to get people to show up at wrong places, wrong times, etc. This is like history, right? This has happened for hundreds of years. What the Dems have done is they have created basically a huge bank of volunteer lawyers that will go to the polls and just make sure people can vote. And so that's reported by people calling in. That's reported by people texting numbers saying, hey, I'm worried about voter access. Maybe there's an ID challenge, whatever it might be. It's all about voter access. And so when we were thinking about this project, about what is a tech-enabled version of that? It sounded very similar to some friends of mine, Juliana Rotish and her team, her program with Ushahidi in Kenya. And I was just like, wait a minute, this is just event-based like incidents. And so the best way to map event-based incidents is to just use a project that already does that. And so we used Ushahidi we had a huge Ushahidi program, and Juliana came and visited. It was great. But one of the best parts about that is it allowed us to quickly dispatch a lawyer to help make sure that someone who was eligible to vote could vote. Because once again, the most important thing for us is to make sure people turn out and vote, the completion of the vote. And another example that we did was we also open source our voter registration apps, specifically because the idea was any organization that valued voting, they could help get people registered to vote. And the reason was very simple, because the more people vote, the more people vote for Dems in 2012.
Right. Okay, so you close the loop, information flowing, people showing up, voting, lawyers. So let's talk about the dark side of data. Social graph, Facebook, was that even legal what you did? So we have, as of the last month, Prime Minister Modi sending customized greetings to people to vote for his re-election. How is this different? I mean, you didn't have like avatars of Obama, but was it legal? And is this not the source of a kind of both surveillance, creepy culture, you were talking about user interface, and also just the source of how you find your targets for misinformation?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of nuance there, which is both my media training kicking in and also the reality. But the first thing is I don't think it has never been illegal. So the question of whether it is legal, I think, is pretty clear. It was very legal. It was also within the terms of service of Facebook. And I think that's the really important nuance, is that Facebook then changed the terms of service in reaction to what we had done, and also Romney had done. It wasn't just us. But the real key there is that we had permission that our users gave us by interacting with us and logging in, what a specific permission that was friends of friends. And so you could see the user's data, you can see the user's friends' data, and then you could see the user's friends of friends' data. That meant that we basically could replicate the social graph with 10 million people logging in a very nice way. And I think the important thing to keep in mind is we only need a graph of 110 million people to cover the entire voting population in the US. It's 110 million people roughly. And so that was pretty good. We did a pretty good job of that. And Facebook was not happy about that because we were basically able to just copy their graph and interact with their graph. They changed that very quickly. And I think the big difference between what we did and Cambridge Analytica did is we didn't buy the data. We had the users consent to every interaction we had. And so the complexity there is that when we did our testing, the users just gave us all the data. Like, I think it's important to remember, and probably even today, people, even if they have a nuanced view on data, or if they have a more expansive view on privacy, they're still willing to give data for all their data for things like a bumper sticker. We would just say, connect your Facebook account. We're going to ask for all the permissions, and we'll send you a bumper sticker that cost us a little bit of money. And then we can use that to do targeting, et cetera. And then we did the targeting via emails, text, what have you. And the targeting was very specific, where we would say, oh, you have this best friend in this battleground state. Why don't you give them a call and remind them to vote? Once again, going back to turnout. And so we did all this, and I think it was very straightforward and very obvious to us to do that. But there was a couple things I noticed. One is, as we got out of the campaign and we described this stuff, everyone was pretty surprised about how sophisticated it was, but it felt like it was the status quo. Like, we thought we were behind, and it turns out that we weren't behind. It was just all the people talking about it hadn't put it into production. They had just talked about it. And so these ad agencies that are like, here's all the targeting you can do, none of them had actually done that. And a lot of what I was focused on was influenced by Tim O'Reilly, actually, who was like, you can do micro-targeting, but how can you do micro-listening? So how do you make that loop a little quicker? And so we thought about that a lot. But the hard part about this, when I think about it in retrospect, is a lot of what we did, I don't have a lot of examples in my life where it was a one-way door. Like, a lot of what I do is a two-way door. You can go in, you can go out. Like Threadless. We made crowdsourcing. It didn't work after a while, and they took off the crowdsourcing part. Very simple. We really did unleash a little bit of what was Pandora's box here, in that the technology we used worked very well. Obama was such a public figure that everyone looked at it. I had Karl Rove tell me he read a dossier on me and my team that was 1,000 pages long. Like it was intense, the amount of scrutiny that we had. So people looked at what we did and then they copied it. And then they used that all over the world, primarily to do things that I personally don't agree with. We saw it in Ukraine in 2014. We saw it in 2016, obviously, and so on and so forth. And there's very few, I think, entrepreneurs, startup people, et cetera, who can easily sit back and point to things and say, hey, that's not what I intended. But we talk about unintended consequences a lot, but it's hard to actually show an example. And I think this is a good example of us inventing something because of hopes and dreams and, Barack Obama as an amazing person. And we were like, yes, let's do this. And then seeing that used against populations that are at risk or what have you is hard. But you got to win.
Can you talk a little bit about Cambridge Analytica, because that's such a well-known case in terms of what were they doing differently in learning from what you guys had modeled, and would you talk a little bit about your take on misinformation and persuasion? Because you're clear, with Obama 2012, the work was not to persuade people. It was just to make sure, clear path, here's the message, get out and vote. What's the difference with Cambridge Analytica? I mean, what they did was illegal, but why don't you talk about what the differences were there?
Yeah, and I don't even know if it was illegal from a you're going to jail standpoint as much as it was illegal from they broke terms of service, which, I mean, I don't even know what the terms of service says on half the things I interact with. Probably I've never read Zoom's terms of service. This might be illegal. Like I think terms of service is a flimsy platform to stand upon, but it was very clear that that Cambridge Analytica did not follow the terms of service nor had any interest in doing so. And so the other complicated thing there is that like they did basically what we did. They added a top layer of psychometrics of all of this stuff of saying, oh, like if you like anime, you're probably an inside person. And so we can target you with things that are more about, introverts, etc., which I think is really smart and scary and reminds me a lot of like the Target story about selling unscented lotions and their model around finding pregnant people by unscented lotions. Like there's all these little bits that if you really have a large population, you can start to find some really creepy stuff. And Cambridge Analytica they were more interested in creating and targeting than they were about being not creepy. And then the other thing is that because of what we did in 2012, Facebook had turned off access to that graph. And then Cambridge Analytica and all the other folks that followed had to emulate that graph because it was so tasty. They saw that and they said, how are we going to do this without that graph? So they had to buy it, etc. And that was sketchy. I'm uncomfortable with the word illegal because there was no law governing it, right? It was a contract breach that was even then was complicated, to define. And, it seems like the worst that can happen is a cease and desist, which is just not very strong. Like it's like that's always after the fact. And so I do think that we need something there that makes these type of violations have a bit more teeth. But unfortunately, I, I think that it's against a really hard rock called capitalism that is probably not going to let a lot of those things happen.
Okay, well, we'll have some time more to talk about capitalism, but having set some of the background and your experience, then observing Pandora's box being open, what would you say are the biggest threats to AI and democracy now?
I think the biggest threat today is not the models or AI. I think the biggest threat today is actually the people who are owning these private models, because what they are doing is it's this weird thing where I remember in the 90s and the early 2000s, the most hated corporation was Microsoft, right? You would just be like, I don't like, it would be terrible. Like I had a bumper sticker on my car that was like, F Microsoft. Like I was so much into Linux. And then you have today Microsoft pushing out what amounts to really interesting models, some open source, but with their investment in OpenAI, many not. And then you have companies like Anthropic that are doing really good things and are, a public benefit corporation. So theoretically have bylaws that govern their participation in the world as good, but have private models. And I worry a lot about when, if we look at AI and how we can easily predict some things, right? There's going to be some people are going to be displaced from work because of AI. That's an easy prediction, I think, if they haven't already. most of the people who are doing the displacement are privately held models owned by giant corporations. And that is uncomfortable for me because we don't have proper regulation or even any form of control, whether it's transparency or not. And the US government has done some things with their you know, I forgot what it was, their executive order around AI recently, but not enough. And then the thing that surprises me the most is that the company, that we previously talked about, Facebook, has released these open models that are both somewhat transparent, the ability to reverse engineer them. I mean, there's still a black box that still is there. But the fact that I can run it on my computer, disconnect from the internet, and run it against a lot of tests, checking for anything from bias to how well it generates, weird, I don't even know, literature that I want to read. You can do anything with a computer that's disconnected from the internet, without having to sign a terms of service, without having to agree to some agreement, although there might be there tacitly. Um, I find that very interesting because what I worry about is control. I'm not worried about AI as a technology. I'm worried about who has access to it, how are they using it, and how do we make sure that it's being used in a way that we as a society are agreeing is good, instead of having corporations making those decisions for us. Um,
Okay, so I'm hearing a split between open source and closed models behind the walls of industry. Does any of that correlate with issues such as deep fakes or misinformation or the other types of things that I think many of us associate with, well, what goes on when you've got a populace that's voting?
yeah, I think unfortunately, and I don't want to use the word nuance too much, but it seems like there's a lot of nuance here in these topics. Specifically, deepfakes, I think, is an easy solution with like the biggest quotations around easy that you could possibly invent, like Jupiter-sized quotations around easy, of defining consent and making some law that makes consent stick. Because deepfakes are a like you could Photoshop something of someone, and that would be a deep fake of sorts in the parlance of today. But I do think that the misinformation, disinformation is way more complex, because then we start talking about whose truth are we actually talking, like whose truth are we holding? And although I believe in facts and I value myself to be very science-based, in the US at least, we don't have the luxury of having facts be the guiding principle at this moment. And so when you say misinformation, it's very easy maybe for you and I, who probably have similar values, to agree what misinformation says. But that doesn't mean that Robert F. Kennedy, one of the leading presidential candidates outside of Trump, agrees. And that's very complicated because we might be able to just put on a whiteboard, here's 4 facts. And if 3 of them are looked at as misinformation by the opposing team, then what does misinformation actually mean and how do you guide that? And I think this is super complicated right now. And I actually think one of the ways to, this is a funny answer, but one of the ways maybe to solve this is to just invest a lot of money in policy and hope it sticks over time. Because I think a lot of the big think tanks are writing papers that are peer reviewed, that have to go through a lot of stuff, and they really value themselves to be nonpartisan. But I just don't know what to do about misinformation, disinformation at this moment. I also don't think that it's just the realm of AI, because there is an awful lot of misinformation that we saw during COVID times, and there wasn't any open source or closed source models generating it.
So, in terms of civic engagement, a public having greater ability to assess, that seems real, that doesn't seem real, where did it come from, provenance, any of those things, where do you see better support for that? For public awareness and public engagement, because that seems fundamental to what it means to have democratic participation.
I think you're right. I don't know. And what I mean by I don't know is, what I wonder is if we had a panel of 10 people all broken apart by generation, I wonder, and I have a theory that the younger people are probably more savvy at detecting things that are not real or that fit inside of a world of generated a generation. Both because they themselves probably have more just experience generating, like for fun, and also because they're bombarded with generated things. Whether you're talking about TikTok videos that use AI filters to, Instagram videos that have generated captions to all of these various things, their lives are surrounded by machine learning generated technology. Whereas I think people who are older, and I don't know where the cutoff is, but I'll go to what my one of my favorite Gen Z people said, boomers like me, so in our 40s and up. Um, I think we are very susceptible to these things. And how that maps to the voting population, I think is concerning. And then how do you educate people to understand that stuff is also concerning because I think education is like a cop out. It's kind of like saying I'm going to exercise tomorrow. It's like it's very easy to say and very hard to do in an effective way. Um, and it takes a lot of effort and resources and agreement to do so. But uh, I just don't know. I just don't know how effective it is. And I worry that the people in power are the ones that are most susceptible to this, i.e., old people like me.
You had gotten halfway through a kind of thought experiment when we were talking over the past couple of weeks around maybe we just shouldn't. What would that look like? Like maybe we just shouldn't
Yeah.
move forward with a whole bunch of these things. But
Yeah.
you also,
I think it's a
well, you were clear. You're like, it's hard to tell a company to pause when the
yeah.
problem is capitalism. So I'm just quoting you. So in terms of maybe we shouldn't, in relationship to the bigger picture of many moving pieces, but we do seem to be having a crisis around democracy and other things, what does maybe we shouldn't look like?
It's funny. I've been thinking about maybe we shouldn't for so long. And I remember in 2015 or so talking to someone who was working on self-driving cars. And the maybe we shouldn't came up in that conversation because it was the idea of we're all working on this. We need to have some sort of agreement as to when we displace truck drivers, not if. And that agreement will allow us to properly retrain, etc. And this was patterned off of a friend of mine had a factory in Indonesia. Like he automated the whole factory, one of those factories where they just turn off the lights and it just runs. And his workers literally rebelled, like burnt down a bunch of stuff, and he gave them jobs back in the factory and kept the lights on. Like, it was like half automated, half not. And he when he talked to him, I remember him saying, like, I wished I had been more deliberate about how to do this. So I'm training people to expect it. And so that was the conversation about truck drivers. It's very easy because also none of us are truck drivers. We're all knowledge workers. And so we were like, oh, it's going to come for them first. It'll be easy. Like it's just going to be self-driving cars. We'll work very carefully. We'll all agree. But the problem with the we'll all agree kind of frame here is that it only takes one person to disagree that releases the trucks that do self-driving, then suddenly every other truck driving company will have to. And like the game theory around that is really complicated. And I kind of regret saying game theory because I try never to say that ever. But there is there's a lot there of like, if you're a truck driving company and your competitor releases self-driving trucks, you have to participate at that level of technology just so you survive within capitalism. That's just kind of how it goes.
I think that you've painted a familiar picture, which leads me to, I think, the easiest question of our conversation. What do you recommend we do? How do we, how do we defeat cynicism and hopelessness while creating a future we want? And I'm quoting you.
Yeah, I don't know. I really have a hard time with this because I think it's this complicated notion of uh the technology that's happening right now is the coolest technology of my lifetime. And I've been around a lot of stuff. It is so much fun to use. It is so cool. It is opening up so much doors. I was just chatting with a friend of mine who is not a technologist that showed me an app that they built. Like I was just like, you just built this, and I just built it. Like it's not very good, and I'm like, yeah, mine neither. And I've been doing this for 30 years. Like it's incredible, just incredible with a capital I. I can't underestimate how cool it is. But I also think we're totally fucked. Like I think that we're really in trouble, both because of how incredible it is, but also because uh, this is a very large bell that we can't unring. And I don't know what warning to give people because there isn't a real easy answer. But one of the things I think about a lot is if we think about displacement from just factories, moving from the US to China to Mexico, etc., and how that created a pretty disaffected lower middle class that then created the Tea Party, that then created Trumpland. What happens when you do the same thing to the knowledge workers? Like, what does extremism look like for people who are knowledge workers? What is that? How does that happen? And how does that lead to the stability of our society? And I think we just have to be very thoughtful of when you erode the middle class so thoroughly, when you erode these people's livelihoods, all over the place, like how do we give them hope and opportunity? And the current options we have right now, I just don't think are doing it well, and we're only at the beginning. So this is scary to me, and I don't know the answer. But I do think we're at a nuanced kind of time period where the decisions we make, and I'm excited about this conference because I think this is kind of like what the conversation we have to have, although we do need to move to practice, which I know is complicated, is the nuance point we're at right now. The point of that we're at is like, do we choose a path towards Star Trek or we do choose a path towards Mad Max? That's what I think about a lot. And I personally like the fashion of Mad Max more, but I don't want to die, and I'll probably be first to die. And I'm a ginger; I'll get sunburned a lot. And so, but I do like the energy independence, capitalism independence, etc. of Star Trek. And I think we just have to figure this out. And part of it is probably some things that are really annoying, like UBI, etc. Part of it is making sure people can afford the things that they need, like food, for example. And a lot of these things that the U.S. is struggling with. But part of it also is having a rational um, regulation about how models are governed. And I don't mean that all models should be open. I just mean that need to have some framework that allows for a company like OpenAI to build models that are changing the world, but also do it in a way where we don't, you know, something weird doesn't happen. And that's because I don't know what the future is. I know it's just going to be weird at this moment.
Yeah, so talk a little bit about having a set of rules,
Mhm.
because that's something that has governed your practice in terms of what you were doing in politics and then what you do with startups, but also a rational perspective in terms of how to interact with AI. When we
Yeah.
had diverse Nazis show up, care of Gemini, the internet like broke. I was like, there are no Kardashians involved. Like, what has happened here? But people
Yeah.
were enraged that the AI model had not produced something that was historically accurate. And I'm not going to use the word nuance because you use it
Yeah.
a couple of times, but I was like, wow, that's what people are mad about. I think it's a
Yeah.
very interesting case in terms of German soldiers, 1943, and then you get United Colors of Benetton. And it's one that I thought it would go away, but it actually seemed important in terms of marking a moment. But can talk a little bit about rational perspectives on interacting with AI, because to the best of my understanding, there was a strongly political creation of a storm around that as well. It
Yeah.
wasn't just the internet being like, oh, that's wacky or that's inaccurate. There was also certain actors who were like, oh, we're going to whip things up around this.
Yeah, and the funny thing about that example, and funny might be the wrong word there, but maybe the interesting thing is that all of the image generation AIs had a similar problem. Either they were, too diverse, not enough diverse. The point is that the training data for these AIs will lead the model to generate a very specific image. So if you look at early DALI from OpenAI, the original DALL-E, you look at them, they specifically enforced diversity within generation. This is a problem that all the models have. And so I find it funny that that Google's problem was a little bit of they just went a little too far to fix the problem of their model. Like the problem is the model, but by them doing that and generating the accidental diverse Nazi, it's just them acknowledging that their model is broken in this fundamental way, and that it's probably a representation of systemic issues with their society, et cetera, and the internet and how the internet represents. And another is like the over-sexualization of women, et cetera. There's so many examples of this from these generative AIs for images. But what I think caught Google by surprise was how quickly the issue was snatched by the anti-DEI, anti-woke crowd. A lot of that is funded by big political donors. A lot of it is funded by people who are trying to generate, anti-woke sentiment. And Google just got caught unawares. I think this is also related to Google's inherent fear of being the center of attention, both from a regulatory approach and from a AI approach. So they have no interest in moving fast and breaking things. Whereas like when this happened with OpenAI, they're like, oh, we fixed it. And then no one cared. Like four forum posts, they fixed it and everyone moved on. Whereas Google's just like, oh my gosh, clutching pearls. Like, we're so sorry, apologizing to everyone, trying to do this like big comms PR issue. And that allowed for their small problem, which I don't even think was a big deal. It was kind of funny. And I think if people just like, but it allowed people to co-opt that. And I think this is a good example of why now is complicated, at least in the framework of US and politics, is that you have people who are working with funding to co-opt these small problems and make them into big deals that fit within their narrative. And this is not, and I think this is not AI. I think this is, when I think about misinformation, this is a good example of a small problem that probably like the narrative should have been, how is your model so white that you have to have prompts to add Black people? That should have been the question. But the question instead was this anti-woke, anti-DEI thing.
Right. So I'm still trying to hear, how are we moving toward collective rational perspective? Because we've got examples of noise and more examples of noise, and you're not suggesting necessarily that we're going to get to the next place collectively.
I don't think we will.
How are we defeating hopelessness and cynicism?
Not through the status quo. I think that's the answer at this moment. I think that what we need is some sort of sea change. What we need is something that allows for, I don't know, anything positive to happen. But what we're up against is Microsoft, right? Like, how do you tell Microsoft that they shouldn't make $1 billion? Like, how does that conversation go? We can't even figure out in the US how to make our planes fly safely because of regulations that have been handicapped, let alone how do we make AI safe. And I think the complicated part is we've spent the last 25 years celebrating Silicon Valley so much that the entire world is at our kind of, not command, but they use all of the stuff in Silicon Valley. And, and I wonder, I think about this sometimes, and it's not a fear of mine, but I know it's an existential fear for the United States. Will the same thing happen with climate, happen with AI? Meaning, will China go through and just solve the problem for China from a climate standpoint with all the trees, all the solar, et cetera, that they've done to fix their climate footprint? Will they do the same with AI? And how do we be collaborative with that? What do we think about that? How do we work within that? Because at this moment, and this is just kind of where I'm at, I don't think the US has what it takes to actually solve this problem. I don't think there's any interest in it from the people who are building. I don't think there's any interest in it from the VCs who are funding. And I don't think there's a lot of interest from the government officials I've talked to. There certainly is a lot of interest in banning TikTok, which seems weird. There's certainly a lot of interest in doing a lot of things that are very performative. But even small regulation, you have mass, VC support for the anti. Anything that looks like it's going to stop innovation, everyone's throwing up their arms and saying this is, suddenly it's communist or whatever. And so I think that's very hard. So I actually think that the best thing to do, like if I was going to bet, I would bet on countries that have rational governments at this moment to start making regulation that then is adopted by other rational governments. An example would be Japan came out very early with saying, generated AI stuff cannot be copyrighted, like super, super early. And and then that will help influence places that they have a space inside of UN, et cetera. And they have rational, and the key with Japan is that they're willing to take a stand and then fix it. Whereas the US, no one can fix any law. It takes years to fix a law. So we don't take any stands. And I think that we just have to rely on some rational democracies and maybe some not democracies to help define some regulation here that we can adopt as a world, whether or not the United States, follows suit. And then you have things like why the new iPhones have USB-C, which is because the EU said it, they had to. Why are we opening up iMessage from Apple? Because the EU said we had to. Like this is, I think, how we do change. I think relying on the US to drive that change is a fool's errand. And as someone who raises VC capital, like the motivation is just not there to be safe. The motivation is there to survive. And a lot of times survival is about making sure that you make as much money as possible. And that is not compatible with trying to be ethical.
Okay, we got to capitalism. Definitely. Yeah. We are in beautiful, sunny Toronto, just reminding you.
Yeah. The Chicago of Canada, I like to say.
Chicago of Canada. And we had a great panel earlier this morning that you're aware of, where people were talking about just surveying, like global survey, and the finding that in, let's say, Global South, there's more enthusiasm and less distrust of some of this new tech, new AIs, than, let's say, in historical Western democracies. So I think in some ways, thinking through that and listening to your last comment, but it is time to invite people to weigh in. Questions, comments. Roger Gross gave a great talk about Anthropic and gauging different standards of safety yesterday. There's been a lot of, in any case, opening the floor for any questions or comments. And as you can tell, Harper's not fragile, so go forward. Yes, in the white vest. Now, sadly, Harper cannot see you. So, I don't know, maybe if you stand up and walk into the middle of the room, he could see you, but just ask a question. Let's see what happens.
So I had a question about, so you obviously talked about the 2012 election campaign, and we saw the technology that you used there, and then there was a change in when it happened later in 2015, and obviously there's been a lot more technology development since then. And so what do you think are some of like the new areas of focus that will come into play when it comes to like technology implementations in election campaigns?
That's a really good question, and thank you for that question. The weird thing about politics, at least in the United States, is that the campaigns are defined not by necessarily the technology, but how the technology is implemented. So for instance, in 2012, I had hundreds of people on my team, whereas in 2016, they had a huge team internally as well. But in 2020, it was primarily contractors, which meant different apps, vendors, et cetera, but not a lot of internally owned tech. And in 2024, it's going to be the same, where it's going to be a lot of vendors and contractors. And so the innovation is going to come from basically what vendors do these political campaigns choose. And what we're seeing a lot of is we're seeing a lot less AI than I thought, just in my experience. And I think and I don't know about anything about the Republican side, so I can't comment on that. But what I'm seeing is there's still a focus on turnout. There's still a focus on trying to get a message out. There's a little bit of focus on persuasion because we have such a weird world at this moment. But what I'm seeing is that there's just not a distrust. I think we don't quite know what to do with AI yet because it's hard to find the metrics to back up the work. And if there's anything that is metric focused, right, like in my experience, it's politics. They test everything. They make sure that everything has a number. That was pounded into my head over and over again. If there's not a number, it doesn't exist, et cetera. And so at some point, someone will come out with a study, whether internal or external, and say, hey, it looks like you can get lift on your door knocking if you use AI to help whatever. And I think it's also important to just talk historically for a second, which is Karl Rove and the direct mail campaigns that were done in the 90s were using very innovative data. Then Obama came out, and Dean in 2004 started using the internet in very innovative ways. In 2008, that came to fruition, and everyone was using, direct mail and the internet. And then in 2012 is when we really started using data. And then in 2016, data came. Everyone was using data. Like there's just a cycle here, which is probably we'll have some really good stories about how people have used or abused AI in this cycle. And then in 2028, it's just going to be the status quo. So I think right now it's just so speculative, we don't know. But one thing I want to remind everyone, David Axelrod has this great quotation which says, "You're never as dumb as they say you are when you lose, and you're never as smart as they say you are when you win." And if you look at Trump in 2016, there was a delta of 80,000 votes or whatever. And if it would have gone Hillary's way, today we'd be talking about app strategies and how do you do mobile apps, because that was their primary focus. Instead, we're talking about targeting and Facebook, which was Trump's primary focus. And so there's such a thin line there that I don't think either one is right and neither one is wrong. It just is, we have to be thoughtful about our bias for the winner. When both of them invested hundreds of millions of dollars to solve the same problem.
Any other questions? Right here, multicolored shirt, and then there are two in the back.
Hi. So similar to how finance is regulated in elections, what are your thoughts on regulating or disclosing the use of data in campaigns?
That sounds like a great idea. And in the US context, the FEC is already set with that. And it would be really interesting if we had to declare, what data we're using and there is also a framework for that already, in that the voter rolls are, for the most part, open source in the United States. And so there are restrictions on use, but the data is open. And so it would be really interesting if there was some framework to say, hey, look, here is the data that you can use, or you have to disclose changes or modification to such data, or what have you. I think I think that's a good idea. And everyone in politics will hate it because it's a change, and change is scary.
We've got a question in the back.
Thank you, Harper. This was really insightful. And thank you for the threadless t-shirts. I have a few that I bought several years ago. My teenage daughters still wear them and make them very popular. So thank you for that. I wanted to ask you, so one of the innovations in the Obama campaign you were part of was also sort of in the type of the workforce. So rather than the policy wonks, people coming from politics and so on, here come the tech workers and in dealing with politics, essentially, with the election campaign. Now, if I remember correctly, many of these workers were coming from what we might call the big tech, the Googles and Facebook or Meta now, and so on. And to what extent do you think it might be a concern that this support by these companies to Obama and to Democrats might have come with some strings attached, more or less implicit and explicit, in terms of what kind of regulation or lack thereof toward these companies and so on, and to what extent you think this might have delayed taking some of the problems you mentioned toward the end of your conversation seriously? Thank you.
That was a very good question. I have not heard this question. I have talked to a lot of people about this in the intervening 12 years, and that is a question I've never heard before, and I really appreciate it because there was a lot of collaboration between a lot of the big tech companies and the Obama administration. But I don't know if that delayed things, because I think the other thing, when we think about that time period, Google, Uber, et cetera, were just starting their big lobbying processes at that point. And so like your point about it being implicit, I think is important. A couple things that I'll share though is during that time, I called hundreds and hundreds of engineers that worked all over. And I probably talked to, let's just say, I'm going to make up a number, but it should be approximate. Let's just say less than 10% were Republicans. And so there was a liberal bias within the startup tech ecosystem at that moment. And they all loved Obama, every one of them. So like I would just say, do you want to come work for Obama? And everyone would just say yes. Like our conversion rate was very, very, very high. And this was me calling everyone. I remember talking to a very, very famous tech person who said, I just don't agree with Obama's processes, but I'd still love to participate. Like he was even a Republican, but knew that he would love to support Obama. Because the other we can't forget that this is, the first Black president. It represents more than just a Democrat Republican. Like this was a historical thing that changed a lot of, a lot of what America represented, and was really important for a lot of people. And so even it kind of surpassed politics. But with that said, I think the answer is yes. I think it did affect technology. I don't think it was as great as the fact that just the technologists and specifically big tech and startup people have too much power within our current society still today. I think that's why people are scared of TikTok, is because the traditional power structures are no longer power structures. And we have to come to terms of the fact that these companies are privately owned or privately controlled in some cases, or in other cases publicly owned, but with share structures that allow for the founders or the CEOs or executives to have control. And I think the fact that we don't have regulation controlling some of this stuff is also an issue. But yeah, I mean, if you look at like whether it's USDS was founded and created by a lot of ex-Googlers, that you look at the amount of Meta employees that were involved, those people have had an influence on that. But I actually don't know if it's negative, and I don't know if it's slowed down policy. In many of my experiences, those people seem to be the most cynical about technology and the most interested in solving some of the problems that we're talking about today. Because the ones that didn't want to solve that stayed within the capitalism framework to try and make more money.
Two more questions? Okay, all the way in the back.
Yeah, as someone who spent 10 years at Microsoft, I assure you we weren't as smart as you think. The question I have is more on data in, less than AI. So, Stalin said, I don't care who votes, I only care who counts the votes. Can you explain to me at this point why all voting machines are not open source?
I can't. I did a TED Talk in 2013 saying we're totally fucked because voting is fragile. Like, I think that's one of the secrets of the United States is how fragile that whole system is, whether it's secretaries of states or the voting machines. I have no idea. It's a wild question. And the only thing I can point to is just like, people trying to make money. Like, I think the problem goes back to that root, which is we don't value open source. We don't value that. It's complex. It confuses us from our framework on values.
Do a micro crowdsourcing. Anybody here? Voting machine intel? Okay, if you think of something, head to the back. One more question? Yes, please. Striped, red.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Multicolor.
This was a wonderful talk. Thank you so much, Harper. I learned so much. I'm a historian. My name is L.K. Bertram. And one thing I did want to correct is that difference between misinformation, which is just incorrect information, and disinformation, which is that politically crafted, manipulative, sort of like deliberately mobilized content. So yeah, and I think like the scale of these influence campaigns, we're seeing it around the world. Indonesia, the Philippines, like the elections are going the ways of this sort of technology, of course. So yeah, this is an old story with the US. This is the story of monopolies, goes back to the days of the railroads. But if you were a lawmaker, say you were elected tomorrow, and you ran on the whole platform of like safeguarding like US elections, US democracy, what would your priorities be to directly address voter manipulation?
I don't know if I have a good answer. I think open source audited voting machines is a I don't know if it's a pillar, but it's a part of that. There's been a lot of talk about ranked choice voting in general at this moment, and other aspects of kind of how we change voting and primarying. I do think that reversing Citizens United is a good idea. I had a very big political person tell me either you need to go all in and just allow all the dark money, or you could go all out and allow no money. You can't have this both sides. And I remember visiting Switzerland and watching a telecom hand out checks on the floor of their government and just being like, what the heck? And they're just like, yeah, it's just so transparent, everyone knows, which was uncomfortable for me as someone who spent time in a place that we try and hide it. And so I think that I would look at campaign finance, and I would look at open auditable voting controls.
Okay, any more ideas? Modi, can people send their comments to SRI? Like, we want to just keep the ideas rolling. We now have Jillian coming back to lead us into the end of the rest of the afternoon. Thank you so much, Harper.
Thank you. Thank you. And if anyone has any questions, I'm super easy to find, just harper@modis.com. Feel free to send me an email. I'd love to continue the conversation.
Great. Thanks so much, Harper. Thanks, Beth. That was just really, really insightful. I got a lot out of that. And if you haven't already, I do encourage you to listen to U of T's What Now AI podcast, co-hosted by Beth, which has some fascinating discussions with the SRI's community, including myself and Roger Gross, as well as our morning panelist, Peter Lowen, who's appearing in an upcoming episode. So with that, we've got a 30-minute break before our last session. We'll come back at 2:30, joined by Avi Goldfarb, Christina McElheron, and Christy Prada for a panel on that topic we started already, AI adoption in industry. See you in half an hour.